following program on Amitirigala 24 is classified for general audience. It is intended for all ages. It contains little or no violence, no strong language, and little or no sexual dialogue or situations.
Tonight, we discuss the intricacies of international humanitarian law and its application to current conflicts occurring across the globe. What legislature governs this area, and does the law adequately address the protection of civilians in conflict? A very good evening, and thank you for taking the time to join us on yet another episode of Law, Land and Liberty, where we bring to you key legal concepts and break it down for the layman. Now, today's topic is something that's actually very current and evolving very rapidly as we speak as well, with updates coming in every hour or so, and that's on the international humanitarian law, specifically in regards to recent conflicts. Now, I'm sure a lot of us would have heard in the news with updates relating to both sides of the conflict and how the humanitarian crisis has worsened as well. But how exactly does international humanitarian law play into this entire scenario? Well, to talk about this specific and very vast topic, we have with us someone that's not a new face on the show, and I believe is best equipped to actually handle this situation and explain to us, and that is President's Counsel Seevali Amitirigala. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's
Thank
a pleasure
you
coming.
once again for taking the time to educate our viewers on this very current topic. Well, before we get into any of the specific details, here's a little bit of a breakdown on how exactly we're going to approach today's discussion. First, we'll be talking about the fundamentals, where exactly international humanitarian law is and what exactly, how it came to be over the course of history. Next, we'll be talking about the current context, the conflicts that are currently occurring, and how the law actually applies in current context. And finally, we'll be talking about the specifics and the future of conflict in relation to international humanitarian law.
Hello, I'm Nimna Pereira from Sri Lanka Law College, and my question is on the fundamentals. What is international humanitarian law and where is it enshrined?
All right, well, we have quite a lot to unpack in this discussion, so without any further ado, let's get right into the topic. So once again, thank you very much. There's a lot for us to get to, but before we get into any of the current aspects of the scenario, we should of course talk about the basics and what exactly international humanitarian law is. So could you please give us a little bit of an introduction on what exactly IHL, or international humanitarian law, is and its primary objectives?
Yes. Anuradhi, let me begin with public international law. Originally, it was international law which regulated the relations between states, and it still does. Of course, the subject matters have expanded into individuals and also associations thereafter. But when you take individuals, the issue comes in when it is a time of war. How do you deal with the evil effects of war? So if you say the law relating to war and peace, it is regulated by international law. If you take Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter, it clearly lays down the prevention of the use of force and the threat of the use of force. Although there's an exception to Article 2.4, which is Article 51, the right to self-defense. Let's say there is a war that has started on the basis of self-defense. Still, there are repercussions that come out of that war. And international humanitarian law deals with these evil effects and the repercussions, dealing with the non-combatants and the civilians who are involved in war. So prima facie, I would say, it is a law, international humanitarian law is a law which limits the evil effects of war. And also it protects the non-combatants and also the combatants who are non-combatant as a result of the war. Let's say they might be wounded. And also, it is known as the law of armed conflict. Briefly talking, I would explain it in that way.
Right. The law of armed conflict, otherwise known as international humanitarian law. I think it's important for us, now that we know exactly what it entails, it's important for us to get a little bit of a brief history into how the law actually came to be to its current context.
Originally, as I said, the Eurocentricity of international law was the one that brought in all these concepts, because we know during the colonial period, wars were dealt by the colonial masters. And the ones who were ruled were merely ruled, and some of them were just taken into wars and asked to fight somebody else's war. But in the present day, international law has dissected, if I may say, into various headings such as international humanitarian law, international human rights law, etc. International humanitarian law and international human rights law are two different. Why? International human rights law applies on a daily basis to people who are living in society. Humanitarian law, on the other hand, is a law which applies during wartime, during the time of armed conflict. So therefore, if you really look at it, the codification of international humanitarian law started in the 19th century. So it is not a law which is that old as international law. It is only a part of international law which has been developed now. It is very vibrantly developed now in the recent years, I would say, after the Second World War.
So we saw a rapid development following the Second World War.
Yes,
and
we
that's
did.
Where we are right now,
Yes,
currently,
yes.
With the...
Because Anuradhi, it was the Second World War which probably was the eye-opener to the world community after the atrocities that were committed, that we have to start respecting human life. And we have to start protecting human lives even during the time of war. Let's say these are groups of people who are in occupied territories. They should have their basic rights. And the Second World War was the eye-opener. And ever since then, we have developed this law.
It is still under development.
It is still continuing to develop, as you say. I perhaps would think we are the lucky ones. We have the benefit of this law at the moment, but yet atrocities are committed.
Exactly.
And that is why you have invited me to talk about this, like many others all over the world, to talk about this. It's an evolving law. Right,
exactly. We've seen a lot of updates constantly pouring in with relation to the conflict. Correct. And really it's a moral dilemma as well.
Absolutely.
There are certain grey areas.
Absolutely.
But before we get into the specifics of that, I think it's important for us to speak about the key principles that comprise of international humanitarian law. If you could run us by
Yes, I would take three important principles, although there are many. I would take three. I think the three important principles that I would talk is the distinction. It's very important during the time of the war to make a distinction between civilians and the combatants. Because this law really applies to non-combative civilians and also combatants who are not actually in war at the time. So distinction, the principle of distinction of identifying what are military targets, what are civilian targets, or what are civilian populations and institutions are important. So the rule relating to distinction is fundamental in international humanitarian law. Secondly, we go on the basis of proportionality. Any military attack must be proportionate to what the threat is. If it is excessive, it's going to end up with a human calamity. So the principle of proportionality applies. Then the next one is military necessity. Is it really necessary to indulge in that act? So those are the principles upon which the concept of international humanitarian law revolves. But I must say there are other topics that have come up lately, because even if you take necessity, it is a question of fact. It depends on the facts and circumstances of each case. So one cannot find immutable standards, but these three concepts needs to be adhered as a minimum, I would think.
Right, exactly. And it's all circumstantial.
Absolutely, because a war involves individuals and territory. And the reasons for war will be different from one war to the other. One might be a holy war, fought on religion. The other might be on land. Sometimes wars also have been fought for certain persons. Like, for example, there have been wars fought for queens. There have been wars fought for individuals.
Exactly. So it's wide-ranging, and even the conflicts we see playing out in the current sphere as well have varying reasons behind as to why they actually escalated or inflated in current day.
But nevertheless, those three principles should apply in any war.
Right. It's a definite must.
It's very important.
Right. I think now that we got to understand there are three key, while there are others, there are three key concepts and principles that we must see being adhered to relating to IHL. Could we please talk a little bit about the treaties and the conventions that are...
Anuradhi, will you permit me to just include a little bit on the subject matters of the law as well?
Please
as far as international humanitarian law is concerned, the subject matter involves civilians, medical personnel, and also military personnel. Now, if you take military personnel, enemies who surrender, they are also governed by the international humanitarian law. When they are sick, an enemy who surrenders, when they are sick and wounded, even a prisoner who is taken, if he's sick and wounded, then the international humanitarian law applies. Shipwrecked, anybody who's in a shipwreck and who's wounded, in such situations too, the international humanitarian law would apply. So broadly speaking, it involves non-combatant civilian populations and even prisoners of war, and you need to treat them according to the law. This is the most important thing. You asked me about the sources. Thank you for asking me, because it actually starts with the Geneva Convention. The most important source I would go down is the Geneva Convention, and there are 4 conventions that I want to talk to you, and also 2 protocols. The first Geneva Convention deals with the protection of the wounded and sick soldiers on land during war. The second Geneva Convention protects the wounded and the sick and the shipwrecked members of armed conflict. The third Geneva Convention applies to the prisoners of war. And the fourth Geneva Convention applies to the protection of civilians included in the occupied territory. Anuradhi, this is very important. As soon as we take control of a particular territory, history said they became our slaves. But that doesn't apply now. They have to be treated with the basic minimum human rights and human respect, dignity that ought to be given to any group of people who are Homo sapiens sapient, because they are entitled to these human rights. And also the additional protocols tend to protect victims of international and non-international armed conflict. We can go into the next segment. We will be talking about non-international conflicts as well.
Exactly.
So also permit me, the 1954 Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict, 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention, 1997 Ottawa Convention on Anti-Personnel Mines, the Genocide Convention, and in the year 2000 optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is very important, on the involvement of children in armed conflict. This is very important. It was year 2000 that this came in, but the discussions were held way before 2000. You know, children are used as human shields. Children are used as soldiers, child soldiers. So the international humanitarian law regulates this kind of activity, preventing these children from getting involved in these conflict areas. Because after all, if we regard children as not having capacity, how can they decide what cause in a war they should hold? Obviously, they are under duress. In such a situation, the children must be protected. So those are some of the sources. I mean, I didn't go into every source, some of the sources that influence international humanitarian law.
Exactly, sir. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small question of curiosity.
Yes.
When it comes to the articles and conventions and treaties
Yes.
that we have existing
Yes.
in place, where do you see the most significance? Do you see there is significance given to a certain piece of legislature or certain convention,
Right.
among others?
Right. That's a very good question, Anuradhi. Because if you look at international humanitarian law and its sources, you have to still look at through the kaleidoscope of international law. International law under Article 38 of the Statute of the Court of Justice lays down treaties, customs, general principles, judicial decisions, and academic opinions. The same applies when it comes to international humanitarian law. I think the most important emphasis is on treaty. So most of the treaties tend to regulate this area. Although there are also international customs relating to international humanitarian law that regulates. And also academic opinions that will go on, because there will be decisions that are coming from the courts, even though they are not binding in the British jurisprudential sense, they will operate as sources of law. I would think treaties are the most important.
Exactly. So treaties, we see a bit more primacy
Yes.
Relating to its
Yes,
enforcement.
like the Geneva Convention would be, because it's the minimum, I would think.
The
And
bare
I think
minimum.
any country which does not adhere to it should be dealt. I think the zero tolerance policy is available. It's the international relations that spoil the whole thing, because international law is a law which can be regulated. Very sad to say, because of international politics, this is completely made, as Austin said, a pure morality as opposed to a law.
Exactly. We see a lot of conflict as well, not just direct conflict in, you know, battlefields, but we see the political arena causing a lot of changes relating to.
Take, for instance, the veto powers. Take
We
the
have seen
purpose.
it recently as
Take the
well.
purposes for which the veto is used. It is not to maintain international peace. It is primarily used for whatever benefit that nation would get. So this is where international law will not be 100% forceful where implementation is concerned. Theory, yes, but practically when you implement it, powerful states would take their own interpretations in its application.
Of course, it's not a utopian context where the...
That is why it is very sad, you know, because international justice, Anuradha, is an important concept. You know, people need international justice. Otherwise, you know, there won't be a world where we could say everybody is safe. So you can't have one part of the world where the people are dealt in one way and the other in a different way.
Yes.
So in a way...
Sometimes there's blatant discrimination.
Absolutely. And then we think, is colonialism existing in a different form? I think if human rights is going to be universal, international humanitarian law must be universal too.
Right. I think that is the perfect note for us to actually move on to the next segment. We have to talk about the current context, of course. We just got a little bit of an introduction.
Yes.
There's a lot to unpack. Even in the past few days, we've seen rapid updates relating to key authorities in the international law sphere actually reacting to the conflicts that are unfolding. But before we speak about the specific conflict and how the international community has reacted, let's go in for a very short commercial break. You're watching Law, Land and Liberty. We'll be right back.
Hello, my name is Tisal Lalapatha and I am a student of Sri Lanka Law College. My question is on the current context. How does humanitarian law work in the presently unfolding conflicts?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We are in discussion with President's Counsel, Seevali, Amitirigala, and we were talking about getting a very surmise introduction into international humanitarian law and exactly what it comprises of and how the current situation is when it comes to the legislature and also the primacy of certain pieces of legislature that we've seen. Now, I believe, is the actual discussion beginning. So we have to talk about the current events unfolding, specifically in relation to the Israel-Palestine conflict. If you could run our audience by, because, I mean, we see constant updates, but of course this happened all the way back last year. So if you could run us through the events.
Yes. I'll start with the Israel-Palestine conflict as pertaining to what is happening now, because it's an old conflict. Very many ways they have tried to settle it, but it hasn't been, and the Palestine state is not yet born. So we saw on the 7th of October that Israelis were taken out of their homes, their kibbutz were attacked by the so-called Hamas forces, and they took about 250 people hostage, and roughly speaking, about 1,200 people dead. So this was a situation where the world witnessed. Little children were taken, they were taken away from their parents, the parents killed. So this was something that was happening in the eyes of the world, and it certainly was a crisis. And you cannot blame Israel, because she is entitled to protect her sovereignty, her people, and her people expects Israel also to protect them and to react. The issue of reaction is the problem now, because they reacted, and in the reaction, as at present, roughly speaking, there are about 34,000 people who have died in Gaza, housing destroyed, no food, shelter for the people has been a problem, no clean water, no medical facility, no ceasefire. They want a ceasefire only if the hostages are handed over, which the Hamas has not done. On a very liberal estimate coming from the Amnesty International, Anuradhi, I'm told that there are 2.2 million people in Gaza, out of 1.9 million Palestinians have been forcibly displaced, and they are homeless. So obviously when you're homeless, all the other evil effects associated with it comes in. So this is the situation in Gaza at the moment. Having spoken about the context, it is important for me to say, number one, as I said, the right of protecting the citizens who are Israelis is with the Israeli government. The reaction of protecting them has to be within the four corners of international law. If they are not, then it is a problem. So while this was continuing in October, in January we saw South Africa filing an action in the ICJ against Israel, going on the basis that Israel is committing acts of genocide, violating the Genocide Convention. Now this case is continuing, but I must say there was an interim measure given by the ICJ where they enjoined the Israeli government from committing any acts of genocide. So this is an interim relief given, and it's an important interim relief because even the Amnesty International went on record saying that there is evidence that genocide may be committed in the process of this war, if I may say war. It's also important for me to say that several countries have formally made applications to intervene in this case. Nicaragua, Colombia, Libya have formally asked to intervene in this. And intentions are also indicated of many countries. Maldives, Egypt, Turkey, Ireland, and Belgium have indicated their intention to also come in. And they're all saying that Israel is guilty of committing a genocide. But I must say there is one country which is in support of Israel, and Germany has said its intention to support Israel, saying the acts are not genocidal. They are mere acts of defending the sovereignty and the people of Israel. So this is the issue with regard to the South African case, that is. But Anuradhi, this is very important. For the first time we see a case of this magnitude.
Exactly, sir. Is there a precedent for this?
Well, there hasn't been precedent of this nature. This is violating the Genocide Convention, and there is interim measures coming out, and starts with one nation, and so many other nations are coming. Anuradhi, permit me just 2 minutes to say this. When international law commenced as a law, we understood that every country is sovereign, and what you do within your country is your business. In other words, sovereign immunity is available for you not to be interfered by other countries. But this concept of sovereignty has been wearing thinner and thinner every day because international law has made inroads into the concept of sovereignty, and now it is the business of the world, if you're treating your citizens badly, that they can find fault with nation states. And that is an improvement, I think, because if the world community has to stand by and watch your government committing all the atrocities on the people, be it the majority or the minority, I think it's a shame. And therefore, I must say it is an important precedent. And for me, what is more important is that the international community is dividing on this line. There's a danger in it also, because there's a danger in it, because the danger is how long are we going and how many are going to come into this? And what is it going to develop into? If it's a peaceful means of settlement, I understand like this. But sometimes patience tend to run out.
Yes, so we might be teetering on the brink of something much
bigger. It would be. It would be. But it's encouraging to see people trying to sort it out through a peaceful means. So in that sense also it is a precedent.
So the existence of international humanitarian law and international law, in a sense, is a little bit of a relief when it comes to...
You're absolutely right. If I may just add something to what you said, this is testimony that international law is law, quite apart from what I said earlier. The philosopher Austin saying it's positive morality. So we should see more of that. People should not take guns and arms and attack each other. They should resolve them through peaceful means. So that is one step that we have come in. So there are many others that I can proceed with it.
Exactly. I think, sorry to interrupt you
no, not
in
at
the
all.
middle there. I think it's important for us to actually talk about the UN and its role as well. We've seen resolutions being brought in. We spoke about veto as well. If you could delve a little bit into that topic so we could have a bit of context.
And thank you very much. Because the United Nations is said to be the organization which came into operation for the purpose of preventing a third world war. In that context, it is successful. There is no third world war. But of course, the United Nations operate with 5 vetoes. And it's very important to see, Anuradhi, this time, on the 25th of March 2024, something very significant happened, where a resolution number 2728, was passed by the United Nations, where it called for an immediate ceasefire. Immediate and unconditional release of the hostages, and they also wanted aid to flow into Gaza. This is the problem. You are attacking Gaza, thinking that you're attacking Hamas, but all people in Gaza are not people who belong to the Hamas organization. So when you starve them, when you forcibly eject them from their homes, there's a humanitarian crisis, which we can see now. So as a result, there is this resolution that has come about. 14 votes were given in favor of the resolution. And this is where I am to say this is very important. Do you know that America abstained? And if America abstained, that shows that traditionally they will not abstain if Israel is involved. They will always veto it or go in favor of Israel.
We've seen vetoes.
We've seen that before. This shows even the Americans are perturbed with the reaction. I like to use the word reaction because they're reacting to the October 7th activity. So it seems the United States is quite perturbed. And I think abstention is quite a liberal way rather than going and supporting it. So I think it's important that Israel has to take note of it, but I'm afraid Israel hasn't.
Exactly. Unfortunately, we don't see much of a proactive stance
Absolutely.
on that sense as well. I think now that we spoke about the UN resolutions as well, the role that observer nations play when it comes to this conflict, we see certain nations, as we've seen in the ICJ, trying to attempt to intervene. How exactly does that play into the actual applicability?
Sorry, I couldn't come up with that earlier. It's just to say this. Palestine is already an observer status. So it's not a state coming in, but observer status. But do you know, Anuradhi, in international law, countries come into existence when the Montevideo Convention requirements of territory, population, government, and capacity to enter into foreign relations is fulfilled. But it's recognition that really plays a big role. Recognition is said to be constitutive and sometimes declaratory. I think it's constitutive. So a recognition will only come in if so many countries recognize you. But you can see that happening now with Palestine. And it's important to state this. There are 27 countries that have openly said Palestine is a state. And we also have recently Spain, Norway and Ireland saying so. This is also a very dangerous precedent for Israel, because if the world community start recognizing Palestine as a state, then of course she will be entitled to all the rights and duties of a sovereign state. So it's important to see it also, as you said, through the United Nations and countries reacting independently of the United Nations, where United Nations have given them observer status. States are saying we need to give them more than that. And I think the reaction of Israel is the cause of that.
Exactly. We see the reaction not being as proportionate as one.
Not being proportionate, not being necessary either. Because you have to really identify whether you're attacking the military targets or civilian targets. The issue that the first conversation we had, actually you can see they're attacking the civilian targets. Children are on the road, and men, women who are innocent, non-combatants are at the brink of attack. This is not right.
Humanitarian crisis, of course. Now that we've spoken about the observer status of Palestine, and also how even just recently we've seen 3 more nations, Norway,
Yes.
Ireland and Spain, recognize Palestine
Yes.
as a state outright.
Yes.
We have to move into the most recent developments. We've seen a little bit comical because we haven't seen a lot of progress on it, but there has been action done by the ICC for arrest warrants for both the Israeli and Hamas leaders. How does that play into the current conflict when it comes to IHL, sir?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. As a person who has taught international law in the law schools for so many years, I am thrilled with this reaction. I'm thrilled because the ICC, the International Criminal Court, although the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court might not be accepted as it should be accepted by the United States and also by Israel, let me say the chief prosecutor, Mr. Karim Khan, requested an international arrest warrant from the pretrial chambers of the court on, I believe, the 20th of May. Anuradi, remember, on the 5th of February, the pretrial chamber decided to exercise criminal jurisdiction on the Palestine-Gaza issue. And once it was done, this was a consequential act that was done by the chief prosecutor, who called upon for international arrest warrants, plus he wanted a group of people who are experts to assist. So let me deal with first the arrest warrants. What I like about this is also that they have issued arrest warrants against both parties. So first let me deal with the Hamas. They have sought, of course I must say, correct myself, they've sought arrest warrants. It's up to the pretrial chamber to issue them. So we are awaiting anything of that nature. We can see Yahya Sinwar, Muhammad Diab Ibrahim Al-Mazari, Ismail Hania, all the 3, if I may say, top Hamas officials against whom arrest warrants have been issued. Anuradi, it will be interesting to see the crimes they are accused of. Extermination, murder, and torture, which are crimes against humanity. Taking hostages, inhuman crimes committed, outraging the personal dignity, are all war crimes. So they are accused of these crimes, which are essentially crimes against humanity and war crimes, which are also under, if I may say, customary international law, which have universal jurisdiction. But here we can see that they have really been very categorical with the evidence. You might ask me, what is the evidence available? Actually, it's very important to state the chief prosecutor has said they've got enough evidence not only to go to trial, they've got enough evidence to seek a conviction. And their evidence has come from interviews, they have come from relatives, survivors, CCTV footage, eyewitnesses, etc. And also aid organizations which were limitedly at least allowed to go into Gaza. This is the problem. Not allowing the aid associations and the aid to go in to assist the people is a problem that is really focused on the Israeli side. So now I dealt with the Hamas for what they did on the 7th of October. The arrest warrants have been issued also, or rather sought, against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and also the Defense Minister Gallant for starvation, willfully causing great suffering, willful killing, attacks on civilian populations, extermination and murder due to starvation. Right. And evidence again comes from interviews, eyewitnesses, aid group participants, etc. Audio, video, and as I said earlier, CCTV footage, etc. The world is witnessing this calamity. And I'm ecstatic that the International Court of Justice has spoken, or to correct myself, the International Criminal Court,
Yes.
International Criminal Court is made to take cognizance and now issue warrants against these parties. How they will play is yet to see. Of course, they will bring sovereign immunity. Of course, they will bring defenses, which I think is contemplated by the prosecutor. What is important is symbolically, at least,
There is a proactive stance.
I'm very happy about that.
Right. I mean, it's, even though a lot of people might think what actually is the restrictions that will be imposed on either side if the ICC warrant actually does go through, but we see that there's been a step in the right direction, and that could lead to a lot more, because the trial could happen and we could have a lot of the information come to light and a lot of accountability in that aspect.
Absolutely,
as well.
because something has to be done.
Exactly. That is, unfortunately, the time in this segment has come to pass. The ideal way for us to actually end this is something has to be done, and something is being done as we speak. Before we go in for the final segment, where we'll discuss about the treatment of prisoners of war and other specific moral grounds, grey areas, so to speak, let's take a very short commercial break. You're watching Law, Land and Liberty. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.
Hello, I'm student Fernando and I'm law student at Sri Lanka Law College. So my question is on future actions. Do the procedures empowered by humanitarian law have real impact?
Welcome back. You're watching Law, Land and Liberty. We're in our final segment in discussion with President's Counsel, Seevali, Amitirigala. Sir, thank you very much for the past few segments. We've seen a lot of context being brought into this very unclear situation for a lot of us. There's a myriad of issues, so unpacking it, of course, is a complete beast on its own. Now that we've actually encountered the final, not final, actually the most current updates when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, I think it's important for us to actually go into a little bit of a less legislative, more of a philosophical concept, because it's not just the law that governs this. This is a complete moral ground that has to be discussed in its own right. If you could explain to us how exactly you actually did hesitate on calling it a war. Previously you called it on retaliation, and then we went to war. If you could elaborate on that.
Yes, because starting from a philosophical point of view, when we lawyers and law students, we study jurisprudence, we study the Greek period. And during the Greek period, we see that the discussion of a philosopher king has been discussed by Socrates. Socrates is the one who spoke about philosopher kings. Actually, countries should be ruled by philosopher kings. Philosopher kings would be the ideal placement to deal with wars. Now, if you take prisoners of war, from a philosophical point of view, they have opposed you ideologically on a dispute, but their treatment matters. You can't dispose them as enemies and deal with them in the most horrifying way. Prisoners are also human beings, and therefore that is why the philosophical element comes in. If you look at the Geneva Convention, it says they should be treated, if they are wounded, they should be treated. Their housing should be looked into. Their correspondence with their loved ones should be allowed, encouraged. And all measures must be taken to safeguard their human rights and to go into a speedy trial if there is a speedy trial or an authority dealing with that. So it's very important to deal with this issue from a philosophical point, Anuradhi, because the point is you can find any amount of wars. You can react as much as you want. At the end of the day, I mean, this is not something I say because I'm a Buddhist. I think all religions would say things are so impermanent. For this impermanency only we are killing so many people and dealing with this. So it is very important to look at the philosophical aspect of why we have international humanitarian law. It's important for the future to say, don't do what has been committed before. This is the law, and you will be dealt accordingly. So a deterrent activity will also form if there is proactive measures taken. And at the same time, if you have hostage taking, of course you could see those parents who come on television and they cry for their children because they haven't done anything. It's only a race that matters. So that is why I use the word reaction, because in this conflict now, with the 7th October issue, the reaction of the Israelis have been an outgrowth. And that outgrowth, unfortunately, is a humanitarian catastrophe. And I think it's important that Israel take some measure to minimize, if not stop it. And from a philosophical point of view, again, as I said, all wars will also be impermanent. You can't have wars forever. You have to come to an end to it and make certain decisions to end it. So from a philosophical point of view too, I think these laws are made in such a way so that at the end of the day, people will maintain world peace and the world will be a better place for people to live in it. Actually, you and I are so grateful because we live in a place where we are not facing half those problems that the people in Gaza are facing.
And our country is not new to conflict.
Absolutely. And this, you know, it doesn't matter which race, which religion these people are from. They are human beings, and basic minimum human rights needs to be observed. And I also say this precedence from the ICC is, as I said, highly appreciated. Well, these are good messages for people who are indulging in this kind of activities, or non-state actors, not only state, non-state actors.
That's exactly what I was about.
Non-state actors. They feel that international law is not governing them. Well, sorry. International law does govern them. And if they commit crimes, they should be tried and they should be dealt. So it's very important from the side of reaction to understand it is a reaction. If the reaction is outgrowth, if it's an outgrowth, then you have to deal with the outgrowth. At the same time, the cause also must be. So that's why I said it's very important that Hamas also has warrants issued against them, because it was they who started. And certainly, Israel is not going to go scot-free. Their reaction is completely disproportionate. And their reaction is absolutely unnecessary. I think there must be ways that you can sort out issues much more amicably than costing such amount of human lives. And Anuradhi, the worst thing that I could say is, my God, these are children, the future of Palestine. This is the future of their nation. And if one day a state of Palestine is to be born, the future is eliminated. You have to look at. That's the point
of having a state at that.
Absolutely. As much as we love our state and we enjoy living in,
we enjoy sovereignty, yes.
Absolutely. So would they. So I wouldn't falter the countries which are also recognizing Palestine as an independent state. It's time that Israel's reaction comes within the magnitude or the limitations of international humanitarian law.
Exactly. It's not that Israel's reaction isn't warranted, it's just the proportion that we've seen.
It's the outgrowth. I understand. I mean, if a group of people were attacked like that, they would react. But the reaction has to be according to international humanitarian law.
Well, sir, we're nearing, unfortunately, the end of this discussion. I'd like to ask you, this may not be the final question, but I think it's important to get your take on this. With the developments we've seen with the ICJ, the ICC, the UN, of course, and the US's most surprising remark of abstaining instead of vetoing, where do you think this will head to in the future? Where do you think we'll see the international community move to, in your opinion? Because, of course, we can never fully predict how it will go. But we've seen a lot more rallying closer to...
You see, Anuradhi, I think there is always that benevolence principle. That people, states now are more benevolent and they tend to stand up for the right issue, which is a good thing. But unfortunately, there are also groups that do things for their betterment only. But I think this benevolent attitude is important and needs to be encouraged. Did you see how many cities in Europe, in other parts of the world, they had rallies, people stood up for Palestinian people or the people in Gaza? Some even don't know, haven't even met them, because we are all bound by this important strand of humanity. So I think that's the key. That's the key.
And that is the perfect note for us to, unfortunately, close off this discussion. Thank you very much, sir, for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a
explain.
great privilege, and it's always a pleasure to come to your TV station. And thank you very much. Very grateful.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Well, as you may have learned with the discussion today, international humanitarian law is not just an instrument of protection, but also a means through which entities can be held responsible for their actions against the best interest of the human race. We leave you tonight with the words of agronomist Norman Borlaug. The destiny of world civilization depends upon providing a decent standard of living for all mankind. That's all we have for you tonight on Law, Land and Liberty. If you had missed any of today's programs, you can always rewatch by catching us on our YouTube page, youtube.com/otherderana English. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good night.